Thank you for joining us for the next hour or two in this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast. In an age of nearly limitless content, we appreciate that you're choosing to take valuable time out of your day to learn more about what is happening in Myanmar. It's vital for this story to be heard by people around the world, and that starts right now with you.
And welcome back. My guest today is Turnell, back for, I believe, his third interview with us. Last time I interviewed Turnell, we spoke about the military's economic policies prior to the coup and during the faux democracy period. Today we're going to be looking at economic developments both on the side of the military and on the side of the revolution post-coup. But before we get into it, I'd just like to note for the benefit of our audience that I am working through an illness, and if there is a decline in quality, I apologize preemptively for that. So, Sean, thank you very much for coming back. And for the benefit of those who maybe don't know your name and haven't heard the previous episodes, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. And just say it's a very great pleasure to be back. And yes, my name is Turnell, long-time academic researcher on Myanmar, but then became part of the policy process under the NLD government. And so I was there from roughly 2017 to 2021. I was taken prisoner at the time of the coup and spent nearly 2 years in Myanmar's prisons, but back now, written books on all of that part, but sort of now back into the policy area, which I guess is what we're going to talk about today.
Excellent. And again, we have done, I believe, 2 interviews with you previously, and I'd strongly recommend to our listeners to go and check those out because they're both very interesting and they delve into a lot of fascinating aspects of both your experiences and the overall economic reality. But let's then jump into the post-coup. There's been a lot going on, so let's first and foremost look at what the revolution has been doing. So we've seen a number of different things. We've seen selling shares off in military properties that have been taken over by the revolution. We've seen the NUG bonds. Early in 2021, we saw an NUG lottery. And we've seen a lot of remittance payments from the international Myanmar expatriate community. So can you talk a little bit about the ways in which the revolution and the National Unity Government have been securing funds?
Yeah, certainly. And I suppose the first thing to start off is just how innovative it's been and how much dedication has gone into it, if you like, at studying what has worked elsewhere. And I guess there was an early recognition, even though, unfortunately time has validated this, that Myanmar's opposition, the fight against military rule, was not going to get much in the way of international support. And given everything in the state of the world, it was mostly going to rely on Myanmar people, in essence, both within Myanmar and outside. So all sorts of innovations, I guess, to finance that revolution. And so we've seen a bunch of things, some of which you mentioned, some of it, I think, extremely innovative and borderline cheeky and I think, makes people around the world sit up to attention, such as the auctioning off of the property of, senior military officials and so on. But then sort of more, I guess, more, sober policies of the sort of selling bonds and the various ways of raising money internationally. So, I think it's certainly been interesting because I guess up until fairly recently, ways of raising funds for movements like this have relied on all sorts of traditional activities. But what we've also seen is very much an embracing of some of the modern technologies, from virtual tokens to cryptocurrencies and virtual banks and all the rest of it. So, quite innovative, which is interesting to me, actually, because, one of the major criticisms of economic policy making in Myanmar, pre the coup, but after the coup certainly, is that sometimes has lacked a bit of innovation, and that's certainly been there, for the opposition.
And so you said that the revolution was not able to get a lot of funding from the international community, and that seems to be the case. But at the same time, we do see a lot of very large numbers being thrown around. The Burma Bill and subsequently the National Defense Authorization Act from the United States, both of those had very large numbers in the hundreds of millions, sort of money that was to be made available for dealing with the crisis in Myanmar. But despite these large numbers that occasionally pop up, whether we're talking about NGOs, whether we're talking about foreign governments, whether we're talking about supranational organizations, United Nations, the European Union, and so on, it seems to always be the case that these large sums of money are being quote unquote made available, but that does not translate to being transferred directly to revolutionary groups, being transferred directly to the national unity government. So what does it mean when governments or large international organizations say that they will be spending a certain amount of money on this crisis?
Yeah, unfortunately, it means that sometimes those numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt. Which is not to downplay them too much, because it sort of represents it's a statement, if you like, of support. But to actually apply the funds becomes then very, very difficult. And I think there's a couple of aspects there. Firstly, there are usually hold-ups within the legislatures or the governments of the countries making those sort of funds technically available. Secondly, being able to access the funds and apply them to activities that meet the requirements that sometimes is put on top by these gifting legislatures and so on becomes even more difficult. So doing the activities that will suit whatever the sending government, if you like, will allow to take place, adds a sort of extra layer of complexity as well. But they're often caught up with all sorts of processes within the sending country as well, so that an announcement might be made by government, but it's usually dependent on a piece of legislation that then has to be passed by a parliament or some other process. So the complexities really become quite extraordinary before anyone gets any money.
And speaking of procedural hang-ups, my understanding is, and this is not something that we've heard a lot about more recently, there was a lot more buzz about this in 2021, I think early 2022. Myanmar as a state has a not insignificant amount of capital stored in the United States, which to my understanding is a pretty normal thing for a lot of countries to do. And neither the National Unity Government nor the military have been able to claim access to those funds. In effect, the United States is sitting on those funds, or whoever handles that, the Federal Reserve, I don't know who, is simply not allowing those funds to be released to either party. Is that still the case? And if so, what's going on with that? Can the United States simply refuse to hand over someone's money?
Well, effectively, and there's an issue here about whose money it is anyway, because the bulk of those funds that have been suspended, and you're right to say that they were in the accounts of the Federal Reserve, the bulk of those funds are actually an IMF payment that was due to be made to Myanmar for post-COVID relief. Um,
Ah,
then the coup took place, and that payment essentially was suspended. So that's the bulk of the funds that are suspended there in the Federal Reserve. So it's a really good thing that I think the US intercepted that money because, of course, it is in the form of foreign exchange and hard US dollars that the Myanmar military could use for all sorts of nefarious purposes. So the fact that it's suspended, I think, is a really good thing. Transferring the money then to the NUG or to the opposition more broadly is a little bit more difficult because here, of course, we get into the issues of who speaks for Myanmar. And of course, legitimately, it is the NUG and the opposition to the military. But in terms of international law and so on, we get into all sorts of complexities on this front, all sorts of issues to do with precedents being set, etc. So there's a bit of a reluctance to make that second movement. So, but certainly the suspension, in my view, was a very good thing. But the second thing, it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon.
okay. So, but just to clarify, then, it is not the case that these funds in the United States are effectively Myanmar taxpayer dollars that the various governments have squirreled away and entrusted to the United States for safekeeping. These are these are external payments that were intended for Myanmar, but that did not originate from within Myanmar.
That's the bulk of them. There's a little bit of money there that could be legitimately said as to belong to the Myanmar taxpayers, but for the most part, it's the interactions between Myanmar and the so-called multilateral lenders, IMF and World Bank and so on. So most of it is money relating to that. So the Myanmar governments down the decades have placed most of their international reserves in other places, but above all in Singapore.
Okay, and we've heard a lot of reports previously of shady economic activity happening through Singapore. So I assume it was no accident that that's where the money was being kept.
Yeah, that's right. It's a little bit, though, that in many ways, legitimately too, Singapore is the logical place because it is the international financial centre, if you like, for most of Southeast Asia. So it sort of fits. And there was actually a very rigorous process under the NLD government of making sure that Myanmar's international reserves were transparently placed where they could earn the best return, basically. And some of that took place, as I say, particularly towards the end of the NLD government, as they were sort of getting Myanmar's international payments all in order. So, so a certain logic, I think, to most of those funds being in Singapore.
Okay, so fair enough. Now, so this is where it starts to get a little bit difficult. Is there any way for us to track approximately the quantity of funds that have been raised by the various revolutionary forces? Can we quantify it?
No, probably not. Which may not be a bad thing. I mean, it's. I think when we're talking about monies that belong to non-government actors, it's would only be natural, I think, for that to be non-public or so. My own bank accounts, I well, actually, there wouldn't be much for anyone to know about anyway. But it's not unreasonable, I think, that accounts that belong to non-government actors are not broadcast, sort of thing. But but it would be difficult to know, and of course, I think the biggest difficulty there would not actually be secrecy in any case. It's probably just coordination, because I would imagine that there's different funds all over the place from various fundraising activities all around the world. So pulling it together and coming up with some aggregate number would probably be quite difficult anyway.
Okay, but nevertheless, the Ministry of Planning, Finance and Investment has periodically stated quantities that were raised through specific ventures. I can't remember the exact details, but I think selling off Min Aung property around Inya Lake, that was, if I remember correctly, it was about $1,000 per share, and they divided it into something like 10,000 shares or 100,000 shares. So that alone was anticipated to raise in the order of tens of millions of dollars. So has anyone sort of been tracking cumulatively these announcements by the NUG of the successes of these various projects?
I presume they have. I haven't been, but I've been watching with interest. But I'm assuming people have. And I've seen, probably like most people listening to this, sort of watching things as they come about, from bond issues, to the sales to these properties and various other things. And certainly the numbers seem, quite impressive. And I'm particularly impressed, I guess, at the Myanmar community, Myanmar diaspora around the world, and its willingness to tax itself, in a sense. Which is really quite extraordinary. But so what the numbers ultimately add up to is not something I know of.
Yeah, but so here's the angle that I think is really important to cover. So what we saw in about the middle of 2021 was the same type of economic phenomena that we've seen elsewhere, but for many in Myanmar, I think this was the first time that they've experienced it. We saw runs on the banks. We saw government or military restrictions placed on the amount of hard currency you could withdraw per transaction, per week. We saw a forced sort of divestment of civilian accounts from US currency and a forced reinvestment in Myanmar Chat currency. And all of these things obviously undermine people's faith in the economic system, but more to the point, the banks in Myanmar, to my understanding, are largely controlled by the military. And therefore, the question is, if someone internationally wants to send financial aid to the National Unity Government or to CDM or to whatever, what sort of financial processing agencies or bodies exist to facilitate the transfer of those monies ultimately to the people in Myanmar who need it, without the military being able to take off the top?
It's incredibly difficult. I mean, it's a good question, and it's a question that bedevils, everything we've been talking about so far, and for good reasons and bad reasons. On the good reason side, we have all sorts of arrangements to try and track money laundering, etc. Now, normally that only implicates people who have bad ends in mind. Unfortunately, here the ends are good in a way, right? It's to help a liberation movement and so on. But sometimes the funds can get caught up into that, basically. So banks, international banks, domestic banks all around the world, most jurisdictions have very strict anti-money laundering procedures, know your customer rules, identification, all that sort of stuff. But of course, we're talking about activities where identification of individuals and identifying where funds are going and so on could be deeply problematic and even dangerous for people who are, nonetheless trying to do their best to do good, if you like. So unfortunately, the funding of Myanmar's opposition to the military gets all caught up in rules that, are well-intentioned, but unfortunately are not helpful in this specific situation. That's one side. The other side, the bad side, if you like, is exactly your point, which is the military control Myanmar's economy in so many ways, including a great deal of control over the banks, including the banks they own themselves, but the crony banks and so on as well. So you've got to try and keep away from them as well, because they control most of the above ground transmission channels, if you like, of money going in and out of the country. So we've got two problems here. You've got an international issue to do with the policing of money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, etc. But then you've got this other side, of course, which you want to try and keep the flow of financial resources out of the hands of the military as well.
And so in combating this, the National Unity Government announced a cryptocurrency as well as the NUG Pay app, which was sort of outsourced to third-party companies, but nevertheless was a fascinating step towards economic liberation from the military by basically saying that, well, we've developed an entirely new currency and one that doesn't have to exist in the physical space. And we've developed an entirely new payment infrastructure, which works as long as your phone works, and the military is not able to intercept it. But the question is, what level of success has this venture seen, both the cryptocurrency component and the payment app component? Like, do we have any information on whether or not this is working?
Well, it seems to be working in terms of the dollars being raised. I'm not sure, again, myself, Hader, the technical aspects of it, the extent to which that's been working or not. I get the feeling that it is. I would imagine that, that it's fairly limited in what it's trying to set out to do. Of course, in many ways, they've sort of been forced into this end, again, because of some of the issues that I mentioned before about some of the normal channels of international finance, etc., are closed off, if you like. And so then you sort of come then into the realm of, well, how do you get money in and out of Myanmar to help people, etc.? Do you go the traditional route, things like hundi and so on, which, by the way, would have the same restrictions legally and so on, but of course, because it relies on very ancient trust networks, they're often highly successful at avoiding all sorts of surveillance. But this is a more modern way of doing it, if you like, and that's why I've been impressed by the innovatory aspect of it, and in many ways sort of living out the promise of a lot of the other cryptocurrencies about that this is a liberation, if you like, from government and government control of currencies and so on. So we've got a sort of real live practical experiment, if you like, underway, which is fascinating to watch. But beyond that, I think time will tell how it works. But it seems to be highly trusted, given the amount of money that people are willing to put to it. And I suppose the thing about it too is that it's voluntary. And that's completely in juxtaposition, if you like, to what's going on in Myanmar, where so much in the monetary sphere is due to compulsion, forced repatriation, forced transfers of funds, all the old shenanigans of a military command economy over in the monetary sphere we're seeing again. So it's quite a breath of fresh air, if you like, if you compare the two spheres.
Mm. And so let's look at the military sphere for a moment, because I think it's very important to understand, because the economy is not segregated into the revolutionary economy and the military economy. The country is the country, and the military's economic policies to date seem to have included, like as I said, placing restrictions on withdrawals of cash, forcing people to convert their savings into chat, which in turn led to a lot of people purchasing gold. There was a big rush to buy a lot of gold. The militaries tried to issue gold certificates. The military has issued a new banknote of the 20,000 chat denomination, the highest denomination that's ever been printed. And I believe earlier this year, or perhaps at the end of last year, they even announced that they expected Myanmar companies to fail to make their repayment obligations to foreign entities in the interest of keeping currency within the country. I'm sure that the list of things that they've done in terms of economic policy has been even longer than that. But my question is, what impact has the military's policies had on the state of life in Myanmar economically?
Oh, just immense, as we might expect. But essentially, and you're absolutely right, the list of these restrictions and impositions, if you like, of the military on the average citizen in the economy is extraordinary. And we'd spend the next few hours just listing them. But we can collectively bring them together. And what we're seeing is a great struggle for control of the economy, but in particular, a great struggle for hard currency. And you know what? If you stand back a bit and look at the policy framework, if we can even call it that, of the military, that's what it really boils down to. Their one objective is to garner as much of Myanmar's economic and financial resources as possible for themselves. And the most valuable component of that, in turn, is international finance, because Myanmar's industry, if you like, has been so degraded, but and accelerated in that decline in recent times, that the military equipment that the military need, they need hard currency to pay for. And even their so-called friends and allies, countries like Russia and so on, are insisting on hard currency payments. So the military in Myanmar are absolutely desperate to get hold of US dollars, euros, basically whatever they can, to enable them to survive. That's really what it's got down to. It's an existential struggle. Their policy framework really touches on nothing else. There's no real education policy to speak of, or health, or anything to encourage foreign direct investment, or improvements, transformation in agriculture, anything like that. I mean, it really boils down to a big question that I think Min Aung Hlaing wakes up to every morning, which is, where can he get more US dollars today? And yeah, all of these items, if you look at them, the end result is more or less the same, which is about gathering as much foreign exchange, as much hard currency as possible for the use of the regime.
But so on the topic of the US currency, I was recently interviewing Mike Hack over in DC, and we were discussing the new sanctions that were placed on MOGE. Now, these sanctions were signaled at the beginning of December or the end of November, and they came into effect a little while ago. And as he was explaining to me, it's not simply the fact that there are now sanctions being placed on the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, which was the major source of US currency, but it also means that financial institutions based in the United States, the financial institutions that handle the US currency payments, are themselves now legally required not to handle and process payments of US currency for MOGE. So in effect, at least the hope is that this is going to limit the military's ability to get US dollars. I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on these sanctions and the impact that would have on the military getting US currency?
Yeah, ultimately, these will be very important, which is not to say that other institutions around the world might not help the military regime avoid them. So we always have to have that in mind, is that whenever you have sanctions, you have parties who are incentivized to avoid those sanctions and evade them, etc. But having said that, what it does mean is that reputable banks now have to be extremely careful, more careful than they were even before in handling payments involving any entity to do with Myanmar. But the big issue here, as Mike said, is to do with US dollars, because US dollar transactions ultimately go through US clearing banks. And so that's where the system catches them up. Now, it still could be, as I mentioned, that international banks with their own US dollar holdings can move funds within their own balance sheet sort of thing, so that they don't need to go through US clearing arrangements, can still do certain transactions, but it makes it more difficult. And that's really the key to it. It just tightens the screws that little bit further. And also, I think, again, sends a signal to reputable banks all around the world, look, you really shouldn't be dealing with these guys. And ultimately sort of pushing some of them into the position of making a decision. Do we want to play the game in the US, or do we want to play with Myanmar's generals? It sort of, can boil down to that.
I mean, you make it sound as though some of these financial institutions would actually be willing to push the envelope and try to not necessarily outright defy these policies in the US, but would try to skirt them. And I'm just curious about that, because we're talking about a obviously evil regime. What's the sort of thinking on the corporate or the financial institution side of things in the United States? Like, would they be saying, yeah, it's an evil regime, but, money's money, or do they have other types of motivations?
No, so I think the financial institutions in the US, unless they're way beyond the law, would not be involved in this.
Okay.
But other institutions in other countries is where I guess my would be where I'd be looking in terms of transactions to evade sanctions. And so where I was going on there is that many financial institutions around the world have US dollar holdings. Now, they might have customers that hold surplus US dollars, say, and they might be dealing with Myanmar's generals who need US dollars. So you would be able to do internal transactions within that particular bank which wouldn't need to go through the US banking system because it'd just be an internal transaction within the bank. I'm sure you could incentivize people within those banks to do those sorts of transactions. So Myanmar's generals might provide something else to the bank, who then provides US dollars, from their surplus holdings, etc. as well. So there's many ways to skin a cat, and if there's profits to be made, you will always find someone willing to meet that demand. And so, I guess the sort of financial institutions we're talking about are the sort that are well practiced in sanctions evasions, banks in Iran, for example, in Russia, and I dare say China and some other places as well. So I think that's where we would need to be looking at in terms of things like, just trying to work out where Modi's money, where the payments are going.
Although that being said, like you point out that a lot of these institutions, non-US institutions, have reserves of US dollars because that's, I think it's the most widely used international currency. But would those institutions not sort of be looking at the situation going, maybe I don't want to splash my US dollars on a cause like this. Maybe I want to keep my US dollars in reserve because, if I fall afoul of these sanctions, that could be bad for me.
Yep, you're absolutely right, which means then that the profit margin would have to be really, really high, which in turn points to the incredible mismanagement of Myanmar's generals, because there would be huge funds that rightfully belong to the people of Myanmar that are wasted in all of these sorts of activities, these nefarious activities to disguise flows. So the inefficiencies alone, would be really instrumental. It's a horrible story, but I did want to just sort of suggest that in the real world, that there is a certain amount of evasion, but it would still hurt. It would still hurt the generals very much. So I'd certainly still support it.
And so, looking at the more international scope, then you mentioned foreign direct investment. We saw a lot of companies, international companies, pulling out of Myanmar immediately post-coup. We also saw a lot of those companies slowly coming back into the country because they, felt that they could get away with it, or their official position was that it's more valuable to provide employment to local people in these difficult times, than it is to stand on your principles and cut the country off. Since the coup, how much foreign investment, how much foreign economic activity has Myanmar retained, basically? I mean, we saw major companies pulling out. We saw Telenor, pulling out. Who is anyone left? What's going on?
So there's been a wholesale collapse, basically, of FDI into Myanmar, and in fact negative, as you suggested, many companies actually just leaving. So the flow of funds and flow of economic activity out of the country has been the big story on the foreign investment front. So the companies that remained are mostly in the traditional areas where companies do remain in highly conflicted environments, and that is usually it's the extractive and the energy sector. So sectors where you can just come in, the activities that you need to do, digging up, shipping stuff out in a pipeline into a ship or whatever, those activities, relatively simple, very limited footprint in the country. You don't really need to get too much involved in the domestic labour force. You don't need to employ too many people. You don't really need to meet all the domestic requirements that many other industries do. So the extractive sector, the energy sector, that's where there would be some attraction still. But even there has been big declines. The investment in those sort of areas are dramatically down as well, because many energy firms, facing shareholder activism and so on back home, just don't want to be involved either. But where we've seen the wholesale exit is anything to do with foreign investment that engages Myanmar more broadly, that needs to rent buildings, that need to pay taxes, that need to consider lots of workers and payrolls and all that. That's where there's been a huge influx or deflux, if you like, out of the country, of which, Telenor would be the classic example. The counter example, though, of course, is exactly what you mentioned as well, which is that real dilemma in areas, say, like the garment sector and so on, which might employ a lot of people, fairly low skill, not very high on the complexity of economic activity or anything like that. But certainly some of that's still there. But again, there's been huge movement out of there too, and for the same reason that many firms, of course, are not willing to live with the criticism that they're going to get in their home countries when they source product from Myanmar.
So there's a strong political component here, but what about China? Because we saw a lot of Chinese investment during the NLD government. We saw China trying to expand its Belt and Road Initiative into Myanmar, along with a lot of other places, and that it doesn't seem to be politically difficult in China to want to work with the Myanmar military. Like, that seems to be something that's okay, or at least it was until very recently with regard to the military's inaction on the scam centers that China's very passionate about. But besides that, have we seen continued investment from places like China or potentially Thailand, possibly even Russia, although I don't think they would have had a lot of investment. But do these allied countries continue to have an economic presence?
They certainly have a presence, but even there, much reduced. And I agree with you 100%, of course. China doesn't really care about the moral issues here to do with its investment, but they do care about stability. They do care about getting a return on their investment. They do care about security and things like that. And of course, all of that is nothing that can be guaranteed by Myanmar's military. So we have seen dramatic declines in investment from places like China and so on as well, even though they're much more resilient, if that's the word one can use, at investing in places like Myanmar. But sometimes, the situation in Myanmar now is so unstable, so uncertain, etc., that we see, big declines in China as well. I fully expected actually to see much more activity on the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative front, than what we've seen. But I think there too, even big infrastructure projects, big state infrastructure projects, you'll notice that many of those, it's just been silence on that front too. And I think that again goes back to the whole issue of insecurity and so on in Myanmar. That's just, Myanmar's a little bit too hot, even for Chinese investors who are usually used to going into places, that are less than stable.
So taking all of these into account, like, what does that look like on the street for the average person, moving away from the sort of macro view to the individual trying to purchase food, trying to purchase fuel, trying to pay their bills, just trying to operate and maybe continue to run a business in cities that have some level of stability? What is the net effect to these people of all of these economic policies since the coup?
Yeah, well, just a disaster, basically. And one has to be careful of hyperbole sometimes. But if we look at Myanmar, that's really those are the only sort of words that you can use: disaster, catastrophe, etc., decline. Because for the average citizen, of course, things are awful. I mean, the latest inflation numbers, inflation in Myanmar year to date to September, 28%. The cost of food is up 130% since the coup. Incomes are flat. In fact, actually even declined. So incomes more or less across the board declined in 2023, even compared to 2022, which were of course much further down from 2021. So if we look at things like rising prices, falling incomes, lack of employment opportunities, the average citizen in Myanmar is just considerably worse off than they were before. But, it extends even beyond that. I think I mentioned earlier about the government's focus, or the regime's focus is just to, get resources to themselves, basically. And we can see that in their budget allocations. So increases in military spending, for instance, are 60% up from before the coup. Spending on health and education are down 15%. And these were already incredibly low levels. So even before the military took over, health and education expenditure were rising dramatically, but they were still below world averages. Now they're, catastrophically below world averages. And, one of the terrible metrics for Myanmar was always that showed that government spending on health and education put together were less than military spending. And that's an incredible outlier internationally. But if we look at it now, not only are health and education expenditure combined less than military spending, they're actually only half of military spending. So, Myanmar is right out there if we look at around the states of the world, in terms of the lack of contribution of the state to the people, it really is extraordinary. I mean, there's that old joke, about a military in search of a country, and that's really what we look at when we've got Myanmar. The military in no sense is a service to the country anymore. I mean, it really has a country to service its needs, and really nothing else, seems to be a consideration.
Mm. Yeah, I think it was originally Voltaire who said that while most states have a military, the Prussian Empire is a military that has a state.
Right.
And
right.
quite opposite in this case as well.
Yep.
I think. But so that's even then, like some of the numbers you're quoting, it almost seems like the reality on the ground is even more dire than that, because you look at the discrepancy between the exchange rate between the kyat and the dollar as provided by sort of official moneylenders, and then you look at the exchange rate that people on the street are actually willing to exchange for. There is a pretty big difference there. Like I've heard exchange rates as high as 4,000 kyat, even pushing up towards 5,000 kyat to a dollar, whereas pre-coup we were looking at something in the vicinity of about 1,500 kyat to the dollar. So the actual official figures, if anything, seem to be underselling how dire the situation is. Petrol is another one that seems to be increasingly not just expensive, but physically very difficult to source. And that's putting people in a worse and a worse sort of situation. And with all of that, 28% inflation is horrific, but it almost feels like it's a miracle that it's that low. We saw a rush to buy US dollars. We saw a rush to buy gold. We've seen people express numerous times their lack of faith in the military-backed Myanmar kyat, the military-backed financial institutions. Why is it that we haven't seen a complete collapse of the currency and just hyperinflation out of control?
Yep, it's a great question, and in many ways we have. And you've hinted at the answer, which is that a lot of economic activity has retreated out of the formal sector and into the informal sector. And it's retreated into simply unavailability of goods. So inflation's always a funny number because, of course, it measures things that can be recorded. But if things can't be recorded, if people are not spending, they might have spent $100 on an item last year, but if this year they're spending nothing on it because it's not available, that's not going to show up in the inflation numbers. So you're absolutely right. The retreat of people into, if you like, their own family space, personal space, informal economies amongst friends, amongst local communities, etc. That's what we're seeing in Myanmar on top of all this other stuff. Also, just on the inflation, though, it is worse, even worse than the official numbers suggest, but still using the official numbers, because when we say that inflation's 28% this year, of course, that's on 35% the previous year and on whatever the percent was, which I can't remember now, the year before that. So if you like, it's accelerating much more than it looks. But also, I think you touch upon another really important thing, which is this widening gap between what used to be the official exchange rate of 2,100 kyat to the dollar and what you can really buy a dollar for in Myanmar, which exactly as you said, can touch 4,000 at times. And I think this whole area is just fascinating to watch at the moment, because I'm sure people would have seen an announcement a couple of weeks ago that the central bank was effectively abandoning that fixed exchange rate, that guarantee that they would provide US dollars for 2,100 kyat for selected people. And those selected people were basically the fuel importers. But they broke even that commitment two weeks ago. So we're looking at something really interesting going on here at the moment, which I think is suggesting that this struggle for foreign exchange is getting even more desperate, because in a sense what the regime is telling people now is that we cannot provide foreign exchange even to our friends. So we've had to abandon that rate, that fixed exchange rate of 2,100 to $1. We've had to abandon that. It's a bit unclear at the moment, like everything is in this area. I think that this whole area of foreign exchange, etc., is characterized by two things. One, incredible uncertainty and a lack of clarity, and two, extraordinary volatility. So the regime keeps changing the rules on surrender requirements, on what exchange rate different people can use, etc., etc. It seems to be changing week by week, and the pace of the change, well, I say week by week, it almost seems to be coming daily now. So I think all this, though, reflects, again, that central point that they're desperate for foreign currency and they're trying to work out how can they do this. Do they put the restrictions ever tighter, but that then sees more people try and flee the net, or do they try and loosen the net a little bit in the hope of gathering more funds in aggregate? I would imagine it's a real dilemma for them.
But so let's look at this, because even the last time we had the interview, we discussed the importance of both mechanical impacts on economies and faith-based impacts on economies. When you have a central bank that is changing its own policies this regularly or reneging on its agreements, when you have a central bank that overtly instructed Myanmar enterprises to default on their payments to foreign institutions, the trust in Myanmar's institutions and in the regime's economic policies is going to go to zero. Whether or not the mechanical impacts are dire, and they are, the trust in the system is going to drop. What impact has that had on the military regime's ability to pursue its economic policies?
Yeah, extreme. So much of this is self-defeating. I spoke about the collapse in foreign investment and so on, but of course that's going to happen. If you've got a government that signals to private sector actors that they should ignore property rights and not pay debts. I mean, it really is amazing. In a sense, the regime is urging its own private sector to default on debt, and so you then ask yourself, well, who would extend a loan? I mean, even in normal times, who would extend a loan to an enterprise in Myanmar? So, which then undermines the real fundamentals of capitalism, which at its heart are property rights. I mean, there's nothing in capitalism as important as that. So if you start dismantling that, you start dismantling everything. And so, yeah, exactly as you said, I mean, this has undermined very much the military's own ability to conduct its activities, but for short-term need over long-term, but also the damage that it does to the country long-term are profound as well. It's again, if one was to just look at the regime and say, well, what are their economic policies about? And apart from the idea of just garnering for themselves as much resources as possible, it's difficult to see anything. There certainly is no long-term vision, but there doesn't seem to be any medium-term vision either. It just seems to be this need to scramble right at this moment for as much foreign exchange as possible.
Because it's in my language, we have an expression that basically means like thief economy, right? Where you're not actually trying to have a perpetuated economy. You're trying to rip up and extract value today, even at phenomenal negative impact tomorrow. And I know that I've asked this question before, and I've asked this question of so many of the guests that we've had on, and it's just something that I still can't wrap my head around. Why is it that the military defeats itself? Why does the military continue to make decisions and policies which objectively and measurably fail? They fail not only to benefit the nation, but they fail to even achieve the military's own stated objectives. And these are exact repetitions of policies that they have enacted in the past, and they have the exact same result. This is beyond doing the same thing twice and expecting a different result. This is self-destructive. Why would they do this?
Two things, I think. Number one, desperation. So the short term matters more than any, medium or long term that is, by definition, off in the future. So that's number one. But the second one, which is perhaps even more important, which is the mindset. What they're really trying to do, apart from this desperate need for resources and their guiding policy towards that end, it's a mindset of creating a military command economy. So in the short term, it's useful for certain things, but in the long term, that is the vision. I cannot imagine that a guy like Myanmar has any understanding of the importance of property rights. I don't think it would even be something that would occur to him. The whole idea that people have incentives, that market economies are consensual based, and trade in rights. I mean, this is a guy who basically people under the military have no rights. He's an old fashioned military guy. Poorly educated, whose view of the economy, I'm sure, is nothing more than his view of the military more broadly, which is that it's about moving resources here and there by order. You don't have to worry about trade-offs. You don't have to worry about creating incentives or respecting other people's property rights or anything like that. His world is the world of orders and unfailing obedience to those orders, and that's why I think he gets frustrated. He doesn't really understand why are these people doing this? Why aren't they obeying orders? And so, I think that's the sort of mindset. If you're creating a military command economy and one that, again, in the sort of feverish mind that he must have, that's sort of based on blind obedience, anything that frustrates that is in turn incredibly frustrating to him. So, I think, for him and other people in the regime, a lot of it, they just don't get it. I think that's number one. But then I suppose that there are other opportunists around it as well. There are people who can take advantage of this situation for their own benefit as well, who might be able to see the bigger picture, and understand that this is not good for Myanmar. But in the short term, they might probably make a profit for themselves or climb the greasy pole within the military or whatever it is. So, so unfortunately, I think we get into the realm of, if you like, non-economic decision making for the economy. So it doesn't make any sense at all if we think about what good economic management might be. But it might have a terrible, inexorable logic of its own within another sphere, and that other sphere, again, might be, the internal politics of the Myanmar military or whatever the cohort is around Min Aung Hlaing.
But it's this extreme of the petulant, self-righteous, self-important, angsty teen of, leave me alone and let me do whatever I want to do, because I'm me and I should be allowed to do whatever I want to do, and you should exist for the benefit of serving me, and you will do what I tell you to do because I've told you to do it. This craving for absolute power and authority, in recognition of the fact that fundamentally you don't really have all that much relevance and power and authority. And it just sounds like the military has basically taken all of the people who have failed to discard this mindset as they've grown and matured and put them into one room. And they're all just reinforcing this concept that, well, by virtue of us saying that something should work, it should work. But you can't do that. Like, the USSR had a very similar problem. Soviet leadership can force humans to do certain things, but you can't force the laws of nature and physics to bend to your will. It doesn't work that way. And they learned that the hard way, and the Chinese communists learned that the hard way. It just continues to perplex me that the military would do this.
It perplexes me too. But the willingness, though, of certain people to try and reshape human nature, it historically doesn't seem to have a lack of supply, unfortunately. But I think that's right. And again, I don't. If I try to understand them, and I think it sort of behoves us to try and understand their mindset a bit. It's sort of the thinking of the barracks, the order of the barracks. So I'm sure for a lot of them, they genuinely don't understand And here I'm not talking about atrocities and things like that. I'm sure they do understand what they're doing on that front. But I think on many of the things we're talking about to do with the economy, the subtleties of what good economic management requires is just something that's not in their lexicon. It's not something they think about. It really is a command and control system. And I think they are probably just perplexed that it could be anything else.
And so let's look at the people who are not strictly within the military, these cronies who operate around them. This is a very interesting dynamic as well, because this is something that we see, for example, in Russia. You have these powerful oligarchs who have become very wealthy through the permissiveness of a corrupt government that has allowed them to centralize. But the flip side to that coin is, if the government makes decisions that are going to tank the economy, then these oligarchs are also going to see their value drop. And there is a turning point, or there seems historically that there is always a turning point where you go from the oligarchs supporting the government in everything it does because the government is allowing them to centralize more and more and more assets. And then you hit that point where the oligarchs realize that at this point, the government can be as permissive as they want, but their policies are reducing the value of the assets that I've spent decades accumulating. And I no longer want the government to continue pursuing its own policies. I want the government to pursue my policies because I'm going to lose everything that I have. And a lot of cronies, have been targeted by sanctions and have been limited in their ability to move internationally. Why would these people who do operate within businesses, who must have some understanding of the economic impacts of these absolutely short-sighted policies and edicts, I think we could probably call them, why would they continue to support the military?
Oh, I think it's a mixture of things, but above all, just self-interest, a desire to protect themselves, protect their families, go along with things. In some ways, a little bit like the way that people think about going into a Ponzi scheme. There is short-term money to be made, but I'll get out when the going gets tough, even if it means, getting out of the country, getting the family out of the country, which brings up the whole issue. Of course, a lot of them are having a bet each way. They've got their kids in educational establishments around the world. They've probably got an exit strategy, things like that. Making do. But a lot of them, of course, see the advantages, So one of the things the military's done by, eliminating a lot of foreign competition, there would be some businesses in Myanmar that would actually have the local market to themselves. So there would be some, who would really be advantaged. Likewise, those with, close contacts with the military and perhaps producing goods that the military would need, who are benefiting from the system as well. So, there'd be a lot, like overall self-interest, of course, I think would rule more generally. But within that overall umbrella of self-interest, I think you would have ones who are out there really profiting on the situation. And I think we've seen the emergence of new cronies who are very much out there on that, as well as some of the old ones, of course. But under that umbrella too would be a group of them that I would imagine who must look at the situation and see utter madness, but thinking, gosh, we've just got to survive this, keep our heads down. This will pass and we'll be back to normal. But it's a great question, because it's something that I often think about, because, during my time of helping the NLD government, we were criticised and lobbied all the time by businesses who were looking for faster reforms, better economic policies, higher growth rates, etc., but, a real acceleration, if you like, of good economic policies and all that. And it was good that they were pushing the government on that. But I often think about, goodness, what are these people doing now? Where, the gap is just so absurdly large now. I can only imagine that the horror that must come to their minds in, the quietness of their own spaces.
And so, with a view to the future then, right, returning to the national unity government and returning to the revolutionary forces, what is the plan here? Because you've got a country that is economically just ruined, right? This was the only country that didn't have a bounce back post-COVID. Like all of the other Southeast Asian countries not only recovered their COVID losses, but actually accelerated above them, as is often the case when you have a period of economic depression. Myanmar continued its economic decline. We're talking about inflation. If inflationary figures are annually in the high 20s, low 30s, then, back of the envelope calculations, inflation would be almost double at this point over the period of the entire coup. And of course, the international investment has fled because they have no faith in the system. Telenor is, again, a very good example of this. When the military decides that it's going to regulate you into compliance, you have no choice but to pick up and leave. And what is the revolution doing to try and set the stage for an economic recovery? Because there is no way that everything is just going to magically disappear.
No, absolutely. So I think the most important thing they've done is to signal that they have an economic vision, that they have an economic turn of mind, if you like, and that the madness will stop. And so, and this is why I feel just a little bit optimistic about Myanmar, if I may, which is that the policies of the regime have been so bad that as soon as they stop, there'll be a natural bounce back really quickly. And I don't believe I'm being Pollyanna-ish in this. So, for instance, 70% of the budget deficit now is funded by printing money. That can be eliminated very, very quickly and easily because we know that because the NLD government did it, removed it completely. And the mechanisms that we've been talking about that the NUG have been putting in place are exactly to that end. So, and if we look at it around the place, cutting military spending, obviously the big one, when we talk about health and education being starved of funds, when we talk about the scramble for foreign exchange, we talk about the chaos of the different types of exchange rates, all the rest of it, all that madness comes down to the one central point, again, which is we've got a military that doesn't really care about the economy. They just care about getting resources to themselves. Remove them then as the central actor, and a lot naturally come back. So, but which is not to be unrealistic, I don't think. But I am suggesting big bounce back, particularly in the domestic economy. The international thing I'm much more worried about because I think exactly as you've highlighted earlier, the things like the regime urging people not to pay their foreign debts and all that. It's going to be incredibly difficult to convince big international corporations to come back. Say for Telenor, someone like that. I mean, how on earth do you convince big entities like that to put at risk billions of dollars, the sort of dollars that Myanmar will need to reinvigorate its telco sector, its energy sector above all, etc. So all that's going to be really tough. But I do think that some really fundamental things could be turned around really quite quickly. So yeah, I'm a little bit optimistic on that actually. And again, I hope not unreasonably so because we've seen it before.
But so looking at the not so much Myanmar itself, but looking at these foreign companies, do we have any indicator from them whether or not they view the revolutionary forces, the national unity government, and so on, as trustworthy? Because the military is a laughingstock, right? It is, none of their promises are worth the paper it's written on, and that is a very literal truth. But we've never had a Myanmar that is liberated from military oversight and control. That is new ground to tread. And it makes sense for the civilian population to say, hey, we want to excise the military from all economic decision-making and political policy. We want to have freer markets. We want to have, telecommunications infrastructure that is actually good and that does not just spy for the government. We want to have these opportunities. But does anyone in the international corporate community look on that and take it at face value?
Well, I think they should, because I think this is the critical issue, right? I don't see any good future economically or in any other way for Myanmar if the military stay around and have the influence they did. And I think that goes to the point that you raised, right, which is that Myanmar has never had that clean slate. So all the way through the NLD period of government, the military is always hovering, and international investors, let's say the military would have voluntarily give up power but remain, the sort of same role that they had under the previous government. that's not going to cut it anymore. It's not going to cut it for the Myanmar people, most importantly, but I don't think it's going to cut it for international investors, because I think quite rightly, as with the Myanmar people, they were thinking, well, when are these guys going to come out of the barracks again? So it won't be enough, something like that, and I'm not sure whether this makes me pessimistic or optimistic, but it seems to me that the victory of the democracy forces in Myanmar need to be complete. It can't be a halfway house anymore. But I do think there's an economic angle to that, because, in the absence of that, I think we can forget about the likes of Turnell and so on ever coming back to Myanmar.
So to clarify, you're effectively saying that if the revolution were to end with a compromise or a power sharing agreement between the civilian forces and the military, as has historically happened numerous times, the international corporate community is just not willing to fall for that again.
I would think so, mate, particularly at the big end. Small scale, yes, because, we see that in all sorts of places around the world. Extractive sector, again, certainly, but perhaps even small scale in other ways too, in retail, blah, blah, blah. But, the big sort of ticket investment, I cannot imagine that, if you were the risk officer in a major international corporation looking at Myanmar as a place to source, a labour force or as a market, etc., you're just not going to put the serious money down if there's even a hint that the military once again could so easily just come back.
Okay. And so let's ride your optimism for a little moment here. Best case scenario, right? Let's say that the revolution succeeds, and numerous people that I've interviewed and that I've been speaking to off record as well have reiterated an approximate 6-month figure for the essential end of the revolution and the victory over the military, except for potentially Naypyidaw itself. So if that were to come to pass, next year, May or June, best case scenario, what do you think Myanmar can hope to receive from the international community, whether this is corporate, whether this is government, whether this is NGO? And what do you think Myanmar would need in order to correct for the military's decades of mismanagement and start setting the country on a growth path?
Yep. Well, again, the biggest step would be the military's complete removal. So if that was the case, then I think all the other reforms become much more credible. I mentioned before that the reforms are fairly straightforward. Because again, the military policies have been so disastrous. Correcting for them, technically, intellectually, pretty easy. But the big thing is, will they be credible? Are people going to believe them? Are people in Myanmar going to believe them? Are people internationally going to believe them? But if the military's out of the figure, then they do become much more believable. Things like printing money, etc., needn't happen if the military budget is not, doubled in size as it has most recently. So there's a whole range of things that seem to me can be done quite quickly. And as I said, I would expect quite a strong domestic bounce back. There would be a lot of sort of dead capital at the moment, which you mentioned a little while ago when you were talking about movement of funds or movement of wealth outside of the national currency into gold and stored commodities, things like that. So, once trust starts to be established, and again, that's what we'd like to see with the full removal of the military from power, things like that just begin to open up. And from that, it becomes a virtuous circle, if you like, of cascading events. Suddenly, the non-performing loans in banks, etc., you start to get solutions on that front once you have things begin to open up, once property rights are respected, etc., once you can actually assign real value to property and various other things. So, so I do think the bounce back could be quite quick. There would also be the release of, exactly as you said, a lot of international money. I'm not. I'm a little bit cautious on that because I think the world has less money, unfortunately, because of all sorts of events around the world. The same lack of attention on Myanmar would still exist then. There'd be a wonderful series of stories for a week, maybe a couple of weeks, of a new era and all that. But then things would sort of rock back into place, and Myanmar would go down the list of international attention again. But nonetheless, there would be a release of resources and energy and concern for the country at that point. But at a practical level, there'd also be the release of instant resources. We began talking about the money in the Federal Reserve. Now, there's $1 billion for a start, that could be released instantaneously. But there's other funds as well, actually, because there's big programs that were being put in place by the World Bank, so the $1 billion is with the IMF, a lot more money in the World Bank, a lot more money in the Asian Development Bank, a lot of projects that could kick up reasonably quickly without even having to rely on any extra deliberations over aid to Myanmar. So there's stuff that would all be tappable really quite quickly. But I think even under the best case scenario, we'd still be looking at a little bit of time before we would see a big turnaround in foreign investment from the private sector. I think, most private sector outlets would sort of be looking at Myanmar and thinking, gosh, we got burnt before. Do we come back, or, just observing the situation?
So they wouldn't be queuing up to jump into that economic vacuum and be the first to capitalize on it. They'd be sitting back and waiting to see whether things look like they're going to be profitable down the line.
I think so, I think also the world itself has changed. The world is a much less optimistic place. The international economy is a much more iffy arena now within which for a country like Myanmar to emerge. So some of the easy wins the countries in Asia were able to pursue in becoming the, Asian tiger economies, jumping on supply chains, all of that. There'd be some scope for Myanmar on that. I don't want to discount that because it would still be the major avenue, but it's much more difficult than it was. A lot of activities with, technological change and so on, even with each passing year, technological change, of course, renders a lot of activities obsolete. So it would be tougher. It wouldn't be the easy ride that some of the Myanmar's neighbours and peers were able to have, but there'd be something there, because there's a lot of reshoring going on. There's a lot of, not so much reshoring, but divergence of supply chains, etc., away from China, of which Vietnam has been the primary recipient of. But Myanmar could grab some of that action, perhaps. But it would be still a difficult environment, the global one, let alone what's going on in Myanmar.
So, do you have an approximate sort of time frame for how long you think it would take to return to pre-coup economic levels?
Oh, really quickly. I would say within a year.
Oh, really?
Because, it's 10% below already. Which is, a shocking performance. So the economy is 10% below 2019 as it is now. But I would expect growth of, 10% in that first year back without too much drama, and again, not even with much policy, to be honest. Just a return of people, return of funds, return of those projects that I mentioned, and then growth on top of that, more sustainable growth thereafter. But I think there really would be a bounce back very, very quickly. In a range of areas. So I think closing that gap within the year for sure.
Wow.
I don't think I'm being wild.
Yeah.
Hopefully that doesn't come across as wild, because I do think that's very achievable. In fact, I think it'd be very disappointing if that didn't happen. I think it would mean that something else was going wrong.
But still, it's very good news to hear. It definitely gives a lot of sort of hope for the future of the country. And if it is true that the revolution is going to be won, most likely in about 6 months, the notion that Myanmar could return to its pre-coup state in about a year and a half from today.
I should add one proviso, of course, is that, of course, the opportunity lost has still been vast,
Yes.
So it would take a few more years. So I'm just talking about getting back to 2019. But, of course, what we've really missed is the growth that should have taken place. Well, not so much 2020 because COVID and, impacted, of course, things like that. But, 22, 23, I mean, Myanmar should have had very high single-digit growth, and that was easily doable. One would have thought. Again, particularly coming back from COVID. So so the foregone opportunities are just awful to contemplate, and that'll take a bit longer. But but getting back to 2019 levels, could really expect that very quickly.
That's look. I think that's still a very positive outcome. I think that's still a very good goal to have and a belief to hold. Certainly a lot faster than I would have anticipated, considering just the shocking state of the economy as it stands today.
So I suppose to share the ideas, mate, is that because you've got me thinking about the return and all of that. I think again, on the basis that the military depart the scene, Myanmar has every reason to feel confident. And I say that because I think some of its steps in 2016, 2017 were quite tentative, looking over its shoulder at the international community, feeling its way, etc. And here, this really just allows me to get back onto my hobby horse, if you like, which is just how impressive some of the young policymakers in Myanmar are. Now, they're scattered all over the world now, but they'd be the sort of people who would return much quicker than the money will return. They know what to do. That's why my confidence in getting back to at least 2019 level of economic activity, that's really where it's founded on, more than just about anything else. But yeah, they know what to do. They can do it, and I think they will do it.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode in full. And if you've gotten this far, then you've heard much of what this important guest has to say. And if you found their story of value, please consider taking a further step beyond just being a listener and becoming an active supporter. Any donation you provide is now going to support the democracy movement in Myanmar to help those being impacted by the current crisis. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanamba yaranamba